So tonight we are in Mark chapter 13, which is about what? Yeah, I was gonna see if I get somebody to lay their cards on the table, but that's okay. Let me push this out a little bit. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
So we're in Mark chapter 13, and my preference is always to walk through the text as we do, kind of a chunk at a time, from the verse 1 to whatever the end verse is. But before we do that tonight, I wanted to do a little bit of pre-work just in case we've forgotten anything from way back in week 1 last semester of Mark. And I want to take a minute just to talk about genre. So when it comes to scripture or literature of any kind, what's genre?
Type of writing.
Yeah, so it's a literary style, right? And the Bible is made up of various types of literary styles. And so because it has multiple genres, we don't read, interpret, and apply all genres the same. Whenever I talk about genre in the Bible, I often talk about the bowl of fruit that we have at our house, which looks a lot like this. And talk about if my kids want a snack, they can run into the house, they can grab one of these apples, run off with it, and just take a bite and go ahead and enjoy that snack. Without thought, without giving it too much energy, grab it, take it, eat it. If they were to do the same thing with this banana, that's not going to be as enjoyable nor digestible. If they were to do that with the pineapple, pick it up, grab it, and just start biting into it, it can be potentially dangerous. And the same is true about genre. If we approach a piece of apocryphal or prophecy literature the same way we do one of Paul's epistles or even some of the narratives or poetry, it could be harmful to our spiritual health and potentially dangerous. And so beginning week 1, we talk a little bit about kind of how this how genre works. On one side of this, you have principles, very realistic writing, propositional, lots of words. And then on this end of the spectrum, you have pictures, imaginative, metaphorical, emotive, less words. And then here are kind of a majority of, if not all, of the Bible's genres and where they fall. So when you've got law and epistles, both of which we've studied in this class, everything is kind of laid out for you in a very realistic way that's easy to understand. It's got a lot of words, but it doesn't take as much imagination for us to interpret it. Where we've been in Mark, in the historical narrative and gospel, we find those right in the middle because we see both principles, things like commands and imperatives, but there's also pictures and parables and emotive language and stories there as well. And then the further you get through, you'll find that the words become more emotive, a lot more imaginative literature, things like prophecy, poetry, and so on and so forth. And so the reason we bring that up is because you can get to a passage, including Mark 13, and you'll notice it's almost as if you can sense a palpable shift in genre, and you can even come to a chapter like a Matthew 24 or like Luke 21. And maybe even Mark 13, and you can say, I feel like there may be multiple genres of scripture in just this one chapter. And so when we get into Mark 13, there's a little bit of question of whether we're dealing this in the entire passage with historical narrative, or do we get into prophecy and apocalyptic genres. And so that's what genre these verses fall into can be debated, but nevertheless, it's important just to have this reminder kind of in the forefront of our minds that we treat different genres of scripture in different ways. And so when we do encounter, though, a book of prophecy or a passage that deals with prophetic language, we oftentimes understand that this is an instance where God is speaking through human speakers, but he's speaking to his people through his human speakers. And though we oftentimes think that prophecy is simply about telling or predicting something that's going to happen in the future, only a small percentage of the Bible's prophetic verses deal with telling something in the distant future. That more often than not, God uses prophets and prophecy to speak to current and close events. The way I think maybe is maybe the best phrase it, or for mnemonic reasons, is just to say that prophecy often deals more with forthtelling than it does foretelling. You take the example of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet, and God used him as a prophet, but his message of prophecy was for in the moment for Nineveh in that context, right? It wasn't something that was super far off, but it was yet very close, and it was a message, a sermon, so to speak, that he was supposed to go right then and now and kind of foretell, here's what's going to happen. Not years and decades and centuries away, but in the moment. And so some prophets and prophecies are clear to understand, while others can be difficult. Many times when we approach these sections, it's in our best interest to try and pick up on major ideas and themes and purposes rather than trying to understand and analyze all the specific and symbolic details. Again, for example, go back to prophets like Daniel and Zechariah. They mention a lot of visions and symbolic images, from everything from statues to horsemen. But the underlying theme in all of these is that God's people are going to endure long periods of persecution, but are called to persevere because they serve a sovereign and good God. And so that's the theme we can pick up and the theme we can take from there. So that brings us to Mark chapter 13. And again, my approach has always been we want to take a book of the Bible. We want to take a chapter of that book. We want to start at the beginning of that chapter and go through the end, or at least from one start of one thought to the completion of another thought when we come to some of these narrative passages. In week one, we always remind people that it's a great disservice to us in reading and understanding the Bible if we open God's Word, read it, and try and go straight to us today. That there's not a direct route there. That it's imperative for us to understand that the meaning of a text is determined by the author and discovered by the reader. So we want to go first, what was God's original message? And what was the intended response in the original context? So there was an original audience. We've talked about Mark's original audience a few times. We want to think about them first and then apply it to us today. When you come to passages that may or may not deal with prophecy, a lot of times the temptation is to go from God's word straight to us today. And so we want to avoid that trap. We're going to think through a little bit today of spending time thinking, okay, what would this have meant to Mark's original audience and the original listeners to Jesus' teaching here in Mark 13, and then think through later how it can apply to us. So, if I were preaching a sermon on Mark 13, to be honest with you, I don't know. My main point would not be when the things that we read about in Mark 13 are going to occur. If we were going to talk about Mark 13 and assume that all or some of this is about the consummation of all things at the end of time, when that happens and when that's going to occur would not be my main point. I don't even know if it would make the sermon at all. There's no inclination in Mark 13 that the timing of the return of Jesus is at focus at all. Mark 13 does not give us a when, he gives us a why. The teaching in Mark 13 isn't given us so that we know when the end will occur. It's given so that we know how to live in light of the fact that there is an end. That as Jesus continues some of his hard lessons, as we've seen through the last few chapters, on what it looks like to follow him, what's it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, it means living with eternity in mind. And there's a lot in Mark 13 that instructs us on how to do that. And so the passage we're looking at tonight is found in Matthew, all the synoptic gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And because it occurs as this long stretch of teaching on the Mount of Olives, it's often referred to as the Olivet Discourse. Mark 13 is one of, really, we talk a lot about how Mark will use interruptions, the Markan sandwich. This is one of those passages of only two times in Mark's gospel that we get a long, lengthy bit of teaching without any interruption from Mark, actually from Jesus. that Mark records. The other time is the kind of, we talked in Mark 4, I believe it is, all the parables. We get an uninterrupted time of Jesus' teaching there, and then we get another one here. And it can be a difficult text to interpret here in Mark 13. There are Bible-believing teachers, really Orthodox Christians who we love, who we disagree on some of the details, and that's okay. When we talk about Mark 13, and I think this was kind of one of the discussion questions we talked on earlier about, whether this is Jesus talking to current events or talking about future events. And so there are those who think that Jesus is only addressing the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in AD 70, while others are equally certain that he has the end times and the end of the age in view this whole time. And there are other views that lie somewhere in the middle and say it's a hodgepodge of both. And say Jesus addresses both the imminent destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but while he's doing that, he provides a preview of kind of this distant thing to come, which would be his second coming and the end of the age. One of the individuals who kind of lands in the middle and says, I think there's a collaboration of both near and far events taking place here, describes it like this. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that's Mark 13:2, which prompted the disciples to inquire about the timing of these things. Apparently, they associated the destruction of the temple with the end of the age. In reply, Jesus skillfully wove together in a unified discourse a prophetic scene involving two perspectives. A, the near event, the destruction of Jerusalem, and B, the far event, the coming of the Son of Man in clouds with power and glory. The former local event was a forerunner of the latter, predicting a far future event in terms of a near future event whose fulfillment at least some of his hearers would see. But regardless, the focus is on commands for how we should live. Jesus will employ no less than 19 imperatives in verses 5 through 37. And he instructs us on how to be prepared for difficult and maybe potentially end times. Many will be surprised both by what he says and what he does not say. And so that's why I mentioned on the front end that if I was preaching this as a sermon, would probably not get to any discussion on when these things might occur, because as this gentleman pointed out, there are 19 imperatives. There are 19 commands in these 30 verses or so that we have to deal with. And so one of the things I'm going to reference a lot is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And if you're hearing like, I don't know much about that, that's fine, because while it may be predicted or even foretold in Scripture, it's not, the description isn't contained in Scripture. And so if you don't know that, it's not like you're not reading your Bible. It's not necessarily in there. It's just, but it is a matter of fact of history. Do we have any historians who want to explain what the fall of Jerusalem looked like, what it was? So, this is not a picture from that day. This is a reenactment. This is a drawing. But nevertheless, you get the idea that there was a time where Jerusalem's walls were breached and the temple was destroyed. So just so you have a little bit of a context, when we say we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem, we're talking about kind of the end of this Jewish revolt, this kind of 6-year war or so between the Romans and the Jews that ended with the Romans being victors, overthrowing the city and destroying the temple. This event signaled the end of the First Jewish-Roman War, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple, which was the heart of Jewish and religious, political, and cultural life. A lot of references in this passage, as we've seen before, to Judea, the region that surrounded Jerusalem. In 63 BC, it kind of became what you call it a client of Rome. And we've already seen, even before they're in this type of relationship, we've already seen the tension is rife, right, between the Roman government and the Jews of Jesus' day. And even though this is a few years later, the tensions are beginning to boil over. And over the next few decades, those between Rome and Jewish subjects were fraught with tension. And so there were a series of Roman governors, and the Jews saw these series of Roman governors as corrupt and insensitive to the Jewish laws and traditions and they just furthered those tensions. So things continue to get worse and worse and worse as we approach 70 AD. Again, and this was an issue we talked about last week, they imposed heavy taxes, and those began to continue to discontent the Jewish population. And so around 66 AD, we get the start of a war, often known as a Jewish revolt. And the revolt was a reaction to, again, a lot of these Roman policies that were enacted. And so initially, there was some success there from the Jewish rebels who managed to expel a small Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem. But if you know anything about the Roman government at this time, they have a lot more power than the small Roman garrison, and so they sent reinforcements. The historian we really rely on, the Jewish historian named, there's a historian named Josephus that we rely on for a lot of the facts that we pull from this era. And he said during this time that the country was filled with imposters and robbers who really deceived a lot of folks, a lot of the multitudes, especially amongst the Jewish population. He also records that the Jews were misled at this time by false prophets who promised that if they would engage in this revolt, God would give them signals of liberty. So even after this small victory, Rome sends a larger force to quell the rebellion, which kind of set the stage for this eventual fall. Spring of AD 70, Titus gathered his forces around Jerusalem. His army was about 60,000 men, including all kinds of troops. And the Roman forces were well equipped and experienced. And they'd already been in this Jewish revolt for several years. The Jewish army defenders, they were kind of in this state of disarray, but they had these walls to protect them, so they just kind of kept on enduring the siege behind their walls, kind of storing food, fortifying their efforts, focusing their efforts on fortifying the city's walls. And so the siege lasts about 5 months. The Romans tried to breach the city using towers and battering rams. When this failed, they resorted to blockade, aiming to starve the city into submission. And the conditions within the city got very desperate very quick. Food and water supplies dwindled, disease began to spread, a lot of the infighting began to occur between those who were revolting. There was a lot of fractured allegiances. And so in the summer of AD 70, the Romans finally managed to breach the third wall. Then the second finally penetrated the heavily fortified first wall, entering the upper city. One of the most significant, heart-wrenching events that happened was the destruction of the second temple. Even though Titus, the commander of the army, told them not to, the Roman soldiers set the temple on fire. Again, we talked a little bit last week and the weeks ahead about the significance the temple played. It was considered the heart of Jewish religious life and was now reduced to ashes. And so the fall of Jerusalem was accompanied by a significant loss of life, carnage. Josephus records. Exact numbers were unclear, but if we go to Josephus's writing, he kind of records what he witnessed, or what he recorded as eyewitness accounts. Talking about the Romans here, it says, when they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they slew those whom they overtook without mercy and set fire to the houses whither the Jews were fled, and burned every single soul in them, and laid a waste to a great many of the rest. And when they were come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, such as died by the famine. They then stood in a horror at this sight, and went without touching anything. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, yet had they not the same for those that were still alive, but they ran every one through whom with they met, and obstructed the very lanes with which there are dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree, indeed, that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood. And truly so it happened, that though the slayers left off at evening, yet did the fire prevail in the night. And now, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms, and oppose to them, but they take the rest alive. But together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirm, But for those that were in their flourishing age and who might be useful to them, they drove together into the temple and shut them up within the walls of the court of the women. So this Fronto, who was put in charge of those who were in the temple, slew all those who had been seditious or robbers who were impeached by one another. But of the young men he chose out of the tallest and most beautiful and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beast. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now during the days where Fronto was distinguishing these men, there perished for want of food 11,000, some of whom did not taste any food, though the hatred their guards bore to them, and others would not take in any when it was given to them. The multitude was also so very great that they were in want even of corn for their sustenance. Now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, and was the number of those that perished during the whole siege 1,100,000. And so I know that's a lengthy little bit of background information, but I think it's very pertinent to understand this as we engage in Mark chapter 13, that there is a level of unrest and destruction and death that was really, not to say that it hadn't happened before, but it was unparalleled, especially to this audience. And you also have to remember that this is also the background that Mark is set on. So we've talked about a late 60s writing for Mark. And so his original audience is reading this, and this is almost a first-hand experience for them. And so we get to Mark chapter 13, right? That kind of records Jesus talking about the temple and about some of the things about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And so I don't know how much more introduction work I want to do. But anyway, maybe we'll bring this up at the end, but you can talk a little bit. There are several schools of thought on Mark 13, and they get categorized into different views. And I don't usually like to put those lenses on top of everyone's Bible beforehand. But the reality is, when we come to verse passages that talk about things like end times, whether we realize it or not, almost everyone already has a lens. And so, just real quick, there's a preterist view that basically says everything that Mark 13 discusses, that Mark 13 primarily refers to the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 in the Roman-Jewish war, with the coming of the Son of Man already having occurred. So there is a preterist view that's just like, hey, everything in Mark 13 happened already. Jesus did not refer to anything in the future. Some of these, even if they were hyper-preterists, would say that they would even deny actual physical, literal return of Jesus. That they would say that happened somehow spiritually in the destruction of Rome. There's also partial preterist view. This view suggests that some parts of the Olivet Discourse were fulfilled in AD 70, while others are particularly in Matthew 25 remain to be fulfilled. So this view is morally associated with those who are just like, all these things have already happened. Then there's the futurist that says this whole discourse in Mark 13, and this isn't just a view of Mark, this is also how they would take the book of Revelation in many cases. It says this is all about future events. They believe the discourse primarily prophesies of events yet to come, including the second coming of Christ, the establishment of his kingdom, and a literal tribulation period. And so each of these have their flaws and strong arguments and not so strong arguments. One of the pushbacks on this one be it's difficult to exclude the destruction of the temple in AD 70 from the Olivet Discourse. But this view would say, hey, this is about future events. There's a historical approach that says everything Jesus mentions in Mark 13 is actually like a panoramic of the view of church history, with these events described unfolding progressively over time, and they culminate in the return of Christ. There's also traditional dispensationalist view, which sees the Olivet Discourse as a prophecy of events leading up to the second coming. not too different necessarily from the futurist or even historical approach, but it's very much taking a literal approach to the Olivet Discourse and Revelation, and also make sure that there's this distinction between Israel and the church. And so, is there one more? Yeah. And then, as always, there's always somebody that comes around and goes, well, actually, it's both. And so we have that here. There's an approach called dual fulfillment that says the Olivet Discourse has both a historical fulfillment with the destruction of Jerusalem and a future fulfillment. And so it's a common view that takes part of the discourse to be historical. Some of it looks back, and then some of it looks forward, or some of it looks near, some of it looks far. And it isn't unusual for the Bible to have near and far prophecy within verses of each other. So I only gave credible views. There are some that are really out there, but nevertheless, let's get into Mark 13 finally, and the first couple of verses, right? As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So we've been in the temple and around the temple with Jesus for the last few weeks now. Now, as they leave the temple, as they're leaving, the disciples make a comment about how beautiful the temple was as they leave for the final time. And the disciple draws the attention to this magnificent splendor of the temple, one of the great architectural wonders of the world. That if you could see the temple from a great distance, and up close it was even more beautiful. That Herod had made the temple twice as large as Solomon's temple, and on the front it was covered with plates of gold of great weight. So at the first rising of the sun, it would reflect this fiery splendor, and made those who were looked upon it turn their eyes away, just as if they were looking at the sun, one writer says. But you could also see it from a distance, like a mountain covered with snow. For as those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceedingly white. Of its stones, some of them were 45 cubits in length, 5 in height, and 6 in breadth. So the disciples are not wrong in being taken back and mesmerized by the splendor of the temple. And as they admire it, what does Jesus say about it? Actually, it's going to be destroyed. Yeah. And as often is the case, as we've seen in Mark, Jesus says something and the disciples don't quite understand, so they ask him to discern it to them privately later. And Mark records that here it was that they got to the Mount of Olives, and here Jesus sat, likely still in view of the temple, but he sat and he teaches Peter, James, John, his inner circle, and also includes Andrew. And they ask him privately, "Hey, tell us about future events. When will these things happen, and what will the sign be when all these things are about to take place?" And the disciples here, it's even more clear when they ask this question in Matthew, they have in their mind, their thoughts are about the final consummation of history, the end of all things. They did not expect a long interval between the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. It really wasn't possible for their Jewish minds to comprehend a scenario in which God would allow the destruction of this temple unless it coincided with the end of the world. And that's why you see the disciples jump from the discussion about the temple to questions about the consummation of all things at the end of the age. So the disciples ask Jesus about a when. They ask him a when question about timing, but does Jesus give them a when timing answer? So Jesus discusses then, he moves on forward. He begins to talk about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Rather than giving his disciples the sign they asked for, Jesus tells them what are not signs. He warns that they must watch, and though this command does not mean simply just to be on your guard, Mark tells them actually to be on guard, and actually tells them to be discerning concerning realities which lie beyond observations of the physical senses. That's what he's saying in these passages in places like, where is it? When he talks about see that no one leads you astray, or coming up here in the next passage about be on guard, he's telling them to use a discernment concerning the things that are happening around them. to look beyond what they might see. And this is kind of why Jesus begins to talk through to the disciples about what's going to happen. It isn't, again, an answer of when things are going to happen, but rather how should they live in light of what's going to happen. And again, depending on your view of Mark 13, this is where Jesus begins teaching with the context being he's instructing his disciples specifically, hey, here's what you will see and face. And then he seems to broaden it out. That's one view, that he starts teaching about the temple and kind of broadens things out, or he's going to use the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem as a type that foreshadows the end time events. So, is Jesus using the imminent destruction of the temple then as a lens through which we should view this destruction of this age, return of the Son of Man? We'll get into that later, but I want to point out kind of the overarching theme. We've already talked about this, that gets lost, I think, in these passages, and that the dominant theme of this passage has nothing to do with signs and symbols, but it's a warning about being deceived against false claims. False claims about Jesus, false claims about the end being near, individuals who try and pass themselves off as prophets. Like, this is a pinnacle concern of Jesus, of Paul, of all the New Testament writers, that folks would be deceived and turn away from the faith. And so Mark's primary purpose is not to inflame speculation about the end of the world, but to urge caution and wisdom, that he cares more about the welfare of his readers and about encouraging them to try and about encouraging them to live well, much more than he does them trying to calculate the details of God's return. And these first 8 verses are much more about the coming deception than they really are, I think, anything related to destruction of the temple or the end time, so to speak. So in verse 5, Jesus says, "See that no one leads you astray." There are 3 scenarios, verses 5, verses 6, and I think we'll get to it again in 23, where Jesus shows the concern about his people being deceived, or about those who claim the faith of Jesus being deceived. The word he uses here for to be deceived means to wander astray. In the Greco-Roman world, the concept of being led astray was often associated with false teachings and philosophies that deviated from accepted truths. So in the context of the New Testament, this word here is frequently used to warn against false prophets and teachers and deceptive practices that could lead believers away from the teaching of Jesus. And this is something the early Christian church was very vigilant about. And they sought to preserve the purity of the gospel amidst a diverse and often hostile cultural environment. There's a lot going on in the passages that we read here when we start talking about things like wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. Those are no doubt scary things, but Jesus' aim here is actually to provide the disciples, comfort and encourage them to endure, to suffer well. His aim in revealing these things to the disciple is, according to verse 5, so that they won't be led astray. So Jesus begins with a warning that is, again, applicable to all believers of all times. See that no one, watch out that no one deceives you. And then he gives reasons why why the disciples might get distracted and even deceived. He first says that many will come in his name saying, "I am he." This is literally, I am. Some will make a claim to deity. They'll say, "I am from God," and "I am God." The deceivers who come claiming, "I am he," don't hail from Christian circles or come from as representatives of Jesus, but they assert the name and lay claim for themselves. The divine authority and rightfully belongs only to Jesus. And so throughout history, there have been messianic dupers. I don't think it just applies to those who would claim to be Jesus and claim to be God or claim to be a prophet, but I also think there's room here to think through philosophies and lifestyles and other religious endeavors that would claim to offer a pathway to salvation. And Jesus says, don't be deceived by messianic frauds. He said there'll be this ceaseless parade throughout history or throughout the days ahead. Imposters, pretenders, glory hounds. Their appearance will not be a sign of the end, but the disciples must ready themselves to see through these imposters and not be caught up in the excitement around them. He said they will deceive many. There are passages like Acts 8 that talk about deceivers, folks who could do miracles and woo, so to speak, people to follow them. And so they said they'll deceive many, and the instruction of the disciple is to see through that. He gets into the next line and begins to talk about in verse 7. He begins to talk about wars and rumors of wars. And he says, even though there are going to be wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. The deceivers who come and claim, I am he, do not hail from Christian circles or come as representatives of Jesus. And so, as the disciples endure, I think, oppose the deception, it would be easy to, I think in these passages like nations rise against nation and kingdom by kingdom, to be alarmed by what's happening around them and say, who's offering me a way to make sense of this, or who's offering me a way to escape this and follow them, right? And so Jesus, again, so the instruction is, see that no one leads you astray in light of all these things that will happen. He goes on, nations will fight against, kingdoms will fight one another, and earthquakes and famines will take place. These types of events set the stage for the finale. Excuse me, I got a little ahead of myself there. But anyway, these will be severe, but in verse 8, Mark says these are birth pains. Now, what might Mark be telling us, or Jesus, I should say, by calling these birth pains?
You're going to see a difference. Like, I try to put it literal in my head. Like, my wife was fine at 8.5 months of birth, and then one day it just was lots of pain. So it's like you'll be able to tell that there's a difference.
Yeah.
I just don't know.
So one of the imperatives here is, even though you're hearing of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. He said, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom will rise against kingdom, yet don't be alarmed. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines, but do not be alarmed, because these are the beginnings of the birth pains. Often in Scripture, birth pains are used as a way to present a difficult period of time that leads to a great event, right? So no one knows how long a delivery will take, or how long it will take, but this is kind of a woe, so to speak, to say, this is just the beginning. You'll see these things, you don't think the end is at hand, and Mark is like, no, excuse me, Jesus says these things are just the beginning. So, the key here in verse 5, Jesus tells them these things that no one will lead them astray. He comforts them by saying, don't be alarmed, don't be anxious. This is not the end. These are the beginning of the birth pains. And so then we move on to 9 through 13. I'm trying to highlight a lot of the imperatives in white to try and help us see, okay, what is Jesus wanting his disciples to know and understand in this passage. And this is where we get to Mark's use of be on guard, something he'll say a couple of times. And so we transition from this general warning about general troubles like wars and natural disasters, and we get specifically to persecution and suffering of Jesus' followers. So it starts with verse 9, be on guard. We'll see 3 more calls to this as we go through this passage. It literally means to watch yourself. Everything happening around you would cause you to be distracted, but it says to stay vigilant and watch yourself. When you look at the verses 9 through 11, and you see the sufferings, the persecution that's described, what do they have in common? It says, you'll be delivered over to councils, you'll be beaten in synagogues, you'll stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness for them. They'll bring you to trial and deliver you over. What does this section there in 9:11, what do those have in common? There's a couple of things. So
Jesus was opposition.
Yeah. So one is, this is they're all formal legal proceedings against the disciples, right? It's a Jewish and Gentile collaboration of synagogues and then governors and kings. So we'll look in the weeks ahead. This is very similar to what Jesus endured. He also was put in the synagogues. He was also taken before rulers and kings. And so that is one area in which they are alike. But then two, what'd you say, Cody?
The same thing. You'll see this with Jesus.
Yeah.
That was what I said, sorry.
This is almost like a fulfillment of when they asked to sit at his right hand and his left hand.
Yeah.
It's like, you will, but yeah.
Yeah. So when he talks about you'll bear, can you drink my cup? You will drink my
yeah.
cup, is what we're talking about. They are very specific in that these aren't just general sufferings where, anyone who's in the realm of a war or a rumor of war, earthquakes in various places, wars and famines, anyone around there specifically is going to suffer. Those are just natural consequences of living in a fallen and broken world. These are specific as you're being persecuted for Jesus' sake. And it's not just formal, but it's also familiar. Verse 12 and 13 says that even in some scenarios, family will turn against you. That brother will deliver over brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And so the caution here, or the description of what it looks like to follow Jesus and what suffering what suffering looks like, it hits close to home, right? Like there are scenarios in which the disciples and those who follow Jesus are betrayed. We've done this at City of God. We have baptized individuals who, once they come out of our baptism waters, can never go home again, right? And so, typically it's an international student. It's been a couple of Muslim students. They can no longer go home. They're deemed an apostate in their own home. And so he says, suffering for the name of Christ will even feel like this sometimes. That those closest to you, that's maybe not something that resonates with us. It would definitely resonate to Mark's audience. We've talked a little bit about his original audience, right? That they were much more likely to be reading Mark's letter, hiding in catacombs than they were sitting in a church. That they were part of a persecuted church under the oppressive hand of Rome, probably being manhunted, and probably had friends or peers who were turned over by a relative. And of course, this is something that Jesus experiences too, right? There's that. But Jesus does give hope at the end of this section, right? He says that you'll be hated for all by my name's sake. That's not the hope part. The hope part is, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The word for endure here is this opposite of the word to be led astray that we looked at earlier. It means to remain. It's actually this compound word of the word for remain and then the word for beneath or under, kind of combining them to say securely, remain securely under Jesus. Or what it's saying is, as the pressure intensifies, as persecution comes and suffering grows more intense, it'll feel like the world is crumbling around you. But the call is to remain. That true faith will remain and endure to the end. And Jesus is there in these first 13 verses, looking his disciples in the eyes and being very open and very transparent and very telling about, here's what the cost of discipleship is. He tells them in general terms what they can expect for following him. He's told them a little bit about what he's going to endure. We won't really see it until the next couple of weeks ahead. But one thing that they make really clear is that the student shouldn't expect to escape the fate of the master, right? A disciple of Jesus, as we talked about earlier, will indeed, in often scenarios in different ways, take the cup. Of course, history tells us that all of the disciples nearly were martyred. 11 of them, minus John, were martyred for their faith. And so the first 13 verses, he makes no bones about the hardships that are ahead, dealing both with, I think, in verse 8 verses, maybe the immediate future and in the not too distant things. A lot of the things that we see here in this passage, in verses 9 through 11 at least, a lot of these things are recorded in the book of Acts. Like you can take these and say, I see examples of this in the book of Acts. Like the apostles were delivered over to councils, right? They were beaten in the synagogues. They stood before governors and kings to bear witness before them. We got 15 chapters of Paul doing that in Acts, right? And so we get to see them kind of walk through this, and I don't think it's beyond us to expect the same likewise, although we maybe have not yet, and maybe it won't look exactly the same. We talked a little bit about that in the First Peter series we did way back, I don't know how many years ago that's been. Sometimes for us, it's not literal physical suffering, sometimes it's ostracism, things like that, but nevertheless still painful and harmful. That's a lot in a little bit of time. Any questions about the first 13 verses real quick? I'm sure there are lots of questions. I can't answer them all. I should tell you up front, Eric has done a lot of work in the Olivet Discourse. I tried to get him, you want to come teach this? He's done a lot of heavy lifting in this area, so if you have any questions, you can go to him directly, or I will go to him on your behalf. So then we get into, at least we get to an easy part now, abomination of desolation. Should be no questions here, right? So after describing various distresses that come upon the disciples, Jesus turns to one in particular distress that seems to be worded in a way that stands out, obviously, and it stands out in a way where it's supposed to be this climactic trial, this climactic trouble that's going to be experienced. And so the abomination of desolation is not only used in the Gospels, but it comes from the book of Daniel, where it's noted 3 times in some prophetic language there. Daniel 9:27, he'll make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he'll put a stop to the sacrifice and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until a decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. His forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the daily sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation. From the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Clear as mud. So this is a borrowed phrase from the book of Daniel, describing this great hardship and trouble for Israel, including really what's a final assault upon its religion, upon its temple, upon its sacred premises. So the destruction of the temple for Jesus and his disciples, for them to witness that, would definitely fit the bill for the abomination of desolation. I don't know that it would have been, in their minds, a culmination of the end, because the following verses continue with instructions. So if this was the end all of all things, you wouldn't have a lot of this down here. And Jesus connects the phrase of meaning of this terrible suffering and tribulation in verse 19, where it says that in those days there'll be such tribulation as not been seen from the beginning of creation. And so I'll try to kind of simplify what's complex. Even though different people have different views on Mark 13, there's a lot of agreement in the idea that the quote-unquote abomination of desolation has multiple fulfillments. That the initial fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy was a desecration of the temple in 167 BC by Antiochus Epiphanes, when he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the burnt offerings and set up an altar to Zeus. This act of idolatry and insult so incensed the Jewish people that they would soon rise up in what history calls the Maccabean Revolt. So that's one instance. There's a second, given the context and passage of Jesus' instructions, it appears as he has another fulfillment in this destruction of Jerusalem. So that there was this incident, this pig, and setting up this idol to Zeus. as seen as a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, but then also in the mind of many, it seems agreed upon that this destruction of the temple in AD 70 would also qualify. That General Titus entered the temple in September, and then in verse 14 it says, then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. There's a sense of urgency here. As one writer put it, people on their flat-roofed Palestinian house must flee by the outside staircase without going inside. The field worker, verse 15, will have no time to fetch his cloak, verse 16. Worst of all will be the fate of pregnant women and nursing mothers, and anyone fleeing in the winter when the ravines and gorges are swollen and impossible to cross. All of these things would have occurred when during this time where the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed. One of the earliest records of church history, Eusebius, talks about the people of Jerusalem fleeing to the mountains when the Romans kind of breached the walls. And so there's a couple of, so to speak, abomination of desolations. So one, again, in that intertestamental period, where this unholy pagan leader sacrifices a pig on the altar and sets up a temple of Zeus. AD 70, the Jerusalem temple being destroyed would have also qualified. And then there are a lot of people who look and say, no, there's another one coming. So there's another group of individuals, again, folks who would say, no, there's going to be another time in another temple where what they would call the man of lawlessness, some might call him, or the Antichrist, so to speak, will be in a temple, and he will be in a rebuilt temple or some version of the temple, and there'll be another abomination of desolation where he'll set himself up as God and declare worship, so to speak. So we have multiple views of the abomination of desolation. And so